Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading How It Feels by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 32, Rust Art. Alright. Check. I'm busy. But you said you'd check. When I wasn't busy. We is. Ugh. Fine. The sheet was snatched out of Ruby's hands as Wise threw her scroll to her bed, the paused video showing the girl had actually been doing nothing more than watching a puppy video. As Ruby waited, she twiddled her thumbs nervously and watched her partner's eyes flick over each question, but Ruby was confident she had got them all re. Question 3 is wrong. What? Ruby snatched the practice dust paper back and looked over the question. She wasn't quite sure how she had managed to get a question wrong when she had pored over it so meticulously. And the question was easy. What would be a safe, but effective, two-form dust fusion to use when clearing out a grim hive? She had absolutely got the fire and lightning are both volatiles. Wise sighed and picked up her scroll again. Without a coolant such as air or ice added to the mix, you would turn where you are standing into a crater long before you throw it into the hive. Damn it, Ruby thought to herself. Wise was right. Are the rest okay though? Yes, the heiress replied testily. Now can I resume enjoying what little free time I have left? Or should I just resign and throw away my huntress career to become a full-time Ruby Rose tutor? As snarky as the reply was, Ruby still gave the girl a smile. Weiss wouldn't have even bothered to look at the paper if she really didn't want to. Thanks, bestie. Ugh. With a quick look to Blake, who gave her a smile that made Ruby's stomach flip, she moved back to the study table and worked on a better answer. The past week had been a busy one. With classes starting back up and the teachers piling on the coursework, there had been little time for anything other than training. But in truth, Ruby didn't mind. Normally she would have. Normally she would have been upset that she couldn't bake cookies or read her comics, but after everything that had happened, she found the work more engaging. It was no longer just the boring work between training and combat, but something that would help her become a better leader. From dust to history to plant studies, all the lessons she didn't pay too much attention to before finally had her undivided attention. She was even asking the teachers for the best recommended reading material and some old exams so that she could constantly test herself. Thankfully, Weiss was an expert at dust, and Blake was pretty good at history. Unfortunately, neither were very good with plant studies, and Yang's area of expertise was moral support. But coursework wasn't the only area in which she had been applying herself more. She had increased her private training sessions by half an hour each day, and she would eventually be increasing it to an extra hour each day. Team sessions were also going to be increased a little. Blake, Weiss, and Yang had all agreed to an extra 2 hours on Saturdays, and Ruby had talked to John and Coco about maybe getting their advice on forming strategies. With all that though, she had found her free time to be a little slimmer over the past week. She still had some, of course. It was always good to relax. But the only other member of their team that was studying harder was Weiss. But that was normal for the heiress. Hey! The voice would have made her jump if Ruby hadn't sensed her girlfriend climb off the bed. How's it going? Good. Ruby smiled as Blake gave her a small peck just below her ear that sent tingles running through her body. It was a new thing, but Ruby enjoyed it immensely. How was your book? Boring. The fauness cooed softly, though there was a dismissive hint to her tone. This is the third mock test you've done tonight. You should take a break. After the next one, Ruby replied with a smile, but found the pen being pulled from her hand. Hey! She twisted around and gazed into firm, amber eyes. In them, she saw a bit of worry, but mostly affection. I get that you're trying to improve, and we all support you, but you might be taking on too much at once. Ruby glanced around the room and saw they were all staring at her out of the corner of their eyes. It wasn't hard to work out that the conversation had been planned by the three of them. Blake is right, Rubes, Yang said from her bunk where her nose was buried in a magazine. You had your nose in those textbooks more than Weiss this week. And you've been annoying. Weiss added dismissively and clicked something on her scroll. But I've been doing better in class. Ruby countered them all. You have, Blake said with a nod. But you're taking on too much too quickly. You need to do this gradually or you'll burn yourself out. Yeah, Weiss can even make you a schedule if you want. Only if she promises to use it this time. The heiress huffed. I found the last one I made for her half burned from dust. It was true that the last schedule Weiss made for her had quickly been forgotten about, but with her new outlook, she knew one would definitely be needed. She could also see that Blake, Young, and even Weiss were acting out of concern. And since Blake was looking at her with kind eyes, she couldn't help but let out a small sigh and reach out for the pen. A small break to spend some time with her girlfriend would hardly be a bad thing. Okay, Ruby said with a nod. Let me just finish this question, then we can watch a movie or something. Blake seemed satisfied with the answer since she gave a sly smile pulled at her lips, and she handed the pen. Sounds good by me. Aw, yeah. Young cheered in celebration and jumped down from her bed. Team RWBY movie night. I'm gonna go rob the couch from the common room again. I guess I will order food then, Weiss said with a shake of her head. You can wait down there for it. Gotcha. With that, Young ran out of the room and Weiss began to swipe away at her scroll. With everyone no longer paying them any attention, Blake apparently thought it was the perfect opportunity to steal a kiss, and Ruby gladly accepted it. The warmth was almost enough to push her work from her mind entirely, but it ended too soon. Plants are good short-term conductors, the girl whispered with a small wink and tapped the sheet before she moved back to her bed. Smiling at her girlfriend's reminder, Ruby quickly began to search for the best way to utilize plant and lightning dust. Thankfully, Weiss' book, which she may or may not have stolen, on dust was rather extensive, and she quickly found the chapter she sought. Movies were always tough to decide on for Team RWBY, since they all had wildly varying tastes. For Young, it was action movies. The crazier the better, and story was not needed. In contrast, Weiss despised such things. For her, it was old black and white films with carefully scripted characters and interactions. For Blake, it was mostly indie films. Films that had likely been seen by less people than attended Signal. And for Ruby, it was more documentary-style movies. People probably wouldn't assume it from looking at her, but she loved to know how things worked on the inside, especially when it came to technology and weapons. Needless to say, finding a film that suited all their tastes was almost impossible. That was why Ruby had imposed a game of it, and the game was simple. They all rolled a 20-sided dice, and whoever rolled the highest chose the movie. It helped avoid arguments, since they all had an equal chance. Though, since Blake had been the first to roll, and had somehow managed to roll a 19, they all knew who would be picking the movie and let out a groan. Ruby didn't hate Blake's taste in films that much, but they did tend to be a little boring than anything Young and Weiss picked. However, unlike usual, Ruby had actually really liked the film, and she was pretty sure Blake had purposely picked it for them. While it was still an indie film with fairly low views, it mostly revolved around a group of teenagers defending their tiny settlement with makeshift weapons. The weapon design was horrible, as were the visual effects grim, but Ruby had fun critiquing the elements she could. As for Weiss and Young, however, one was asleep, and the other was fiddling with her gauntlets. She and Blake, though, were happily cuddled up on the couch as they watched the final minutes of the film. A blanket had been retrieved almost an hour ago and thrown over them due to the fact Vale was still a little chilly, and though Young had tried multiple times to get under it, Ruby had kicked her each time because she knew that the girl would try and tickle her beneath it. However, as the credits began to roll, the blonde stood up and stretched. "Thank God that's over," she said, and let out a yawn before putting on her best Vacuic accent to mimic the cast. "No offense, partner. Not my fault you have bad taste in movies." Blake smirked at her partner, as Ruby felt the girl's thumb begin to gently rotate in her palm. "Ruby liked it at least." "It was all right," Ruby chuckled. You both need to learn the glory of a good action movie." Young groaned and turned to look at Weiss. "At least she had the right idea." She reached out to poke the sleeping heiress. "Hey, sleeping beauty. Film's over." Weiss was so deep in her slumber that the only reply they all got was a soft, incoherent hum. In truth, the girl was pretty cute curled up on the corner of the couch. Not that she wasn't normally, but there was something about seeing her so relaxed. It was a state that people very rarely saw, and Ruby couldn't help but feel lucky to be considered someone Weiss could relax around. "I don't think she's gonna wake up," Ruby answered for her partner. Young sighed and leaned down to slip her arms beneath the girl. "Every other movie night. She really needs to start paying me." With a small grunt that Ruby knew was only for show since Weiss weighed practically nothing, Young lifted the heiress gently in her arms and stepped away from the couch. "I think she's still confused about how she ends up in her bed." Blake laughed as Young began to move towards the bed. Yeah, well, speaking of beds, the blonde replied as she set Wise down and pulled the quilt over her. That's where I'm headed. Don't you two stay up too late. Just got watched this Extraordinary Tales episode to watch, then I'm gonna go too. Ruby replied with a small wave. Night. Night, Blake said and pointed to a book on the shelf. Once Blake caught the book, Yang jumped up onto her bed and hung her gauntlets on the bedpost, while Ruby turned back to the holoviewer. The next 15 minutes were enjoyable for Ruby. As Blake sat there reading, Ruby happily leaned against her and watched her program. Unfortunately, the tale they were telling was rather boring, simply revolving around what was clearly a creep in a garden, so there was nothing to really distract her from the fact that Blake's thumb was still idly circling her palm. The night had actually been quite fun, and after a week of dedicating herself to her studies, very much needed. And it was thanks to her girlfriend for talking to her. Sure, Weiss and Yang would have been able to talk her into a movie too, but it had been Blake who actually came over and intervened. And wanting to show just how grateful she was, Ruby gently squeezed the fawn's fingers to get her attention. The second the girl turned around, Ruby gave her a smile and pressed a kiss to her lips. The smile on her face widened due to the fact she had obviously caught Blake off guard, if the hum of surprise was anything to go by. Happy at that fact, Ruby pressed her advantage and shifted herself up a little so that they were the same height, but Blake had already begun to respond. The book hadn't dropped, but it was definitely forgotten. However, Ruby didn't keep the kiss going for long and pulled away with a cheeky grin. And that was for what? Blake chuckled suspiciously when she recovered. Ruby returned to the hug and settled back into her girlfriend to enjoy the warmth of her body beneath the blanket. For being awesome, Ruby replied and stuck out her tongue. And getting me to take a break. Well, you weren't exactly hard to convince. Blake laughed and looked back at her book. Unlike Weiss. Yeah. Ruby scooted closer and felt Blake's hand leave hers to slide around her waist. I'm not that stubborn. Yet. Give Weiss time, and she will get you to be. The fawness smiled and turned a page, though Ruby was sure she hadn't actually finished the previous one. But for what it's worth, I get why you've been so focused on schoolwork this week. You do? I wasn't blind to how you felt after the fight. Her voice was a little more gentle, but she was still cheerful. And I know why you felt that way. If you want to study more and work harder to improve, then you definitely have my support. Just please don't overwork yourself. I do still want to spend some time with my girlfriend. I'll definitely use that schedule Weiss is making for me. Good. There was a hint of relief in Blake's voice, and Ruby cuddled up to her girlfriend to reassure her a little. She very much intended to fulfill her end of the bargain, and wanted Blake to know that. Thankfully, the arm around her waist tightened a little and Ruby gave a small, inward smile at the fact it worked. How was the film, by the way? The tone of the question was a little off. Almost smug and self-satisfied, enough so to make Ruby glance at the girl. Did you cheat to pick the movie? I have no idea what you were talking about. The lie was entirely unconvincing. Okay, maybe I wanted you to watch the film with me. Ruby rolled her eyes and let out a chuckle. She had no idea how it was possible to cheat at a dice roll. So, did you enjoy it? It was okay, Ruby admitted with a smile as she looked up to her girlfriend. The weapons were a little lame though. Except that shotgun shovel. Why? Of course you like that. Blake grinned and turned another unread page. But they are releasing a second part next week, and since our last date was interrupted, I was wondering if you maybe wanted to come and check it out with me. They got an actual huntsman to help with the weapons this time. You're asking me out on an actual date? Ruby sat up again and looked at her girlfriend. Well, Blake's gaze fell down onto hers. We do have plenty of reward money to spend. We can maybe go shopping afterwards. I could buy you a new pair of boots to replace the ones you lost in the hill. They were one of my favorite pairs. Blake bit her bottom lip. So is that a yes? Instead of giving a nod, Ruby pressed her lips against Blake's again and felt the girl immediately respond. However, before she could really get lost in the kiss, the ninja pulled away and gave her a teasing grin. I'm still not Sue. She wasted no time reinitiating the kiss, though that time she reached out to place a hand on Blake's leg. Thankfully, Blake seemed done with the games, and Ruby felt a pressure on her back as she was pulled deeper into the makeout session. Before she knew it, the book was discarded and another hand was placed on her cheek, the finger slowly pushing into her hair and causing a low groan to escape her. Ruby really liked how experienced Blake's hands were. How, unless it was a new step, they never seemed to hesitate in what they were doing. Whatever Blake wanted, her hands would take, and Ruby was happy to give. It was something she was trying to work on more herself. She was still a little hesitant in her exploration, still nervous about putting her hands somewhere she wasn't ready to go. But she was slowly working through it. Bit by bit, her hands were beginning to respond to her desires more, and as she shuffled a little closer and forced her girlfriend to lean backward, she let her hand roam upwards a little. Though she made sure to avoid that area, it finally landed on Blake's stomach, the firm muscle beneath the thin yukata-style nightshirt feeling wonderful beneath her fingertips. As her hand slid over it, the raven-haired girl took in a sharp breath of pleasure and leaned back even further. She was practically laid down now, and her body twisted to get situated better on the couch. Before Ruby knew it, she was laid between her girlfriend's legs, the raised knees keeping her in place. Not that Ruby minded at all. In fact, she moved herself up a little higher. One of her hands slid down beside Blake to stabilize herself as teeth clamped down gently on her bottom lip caused a low, hungry groan to escape her. It wasn't a sound she had produced before, and hadn't even consciously made. It felt like it was dragged from her, the knowledge that Blake wanted her so badly driving her body to act on its own. "Are you okay?" Blake tried to say when she released the lip and pulled back a little, but Ruby cut her off. In truth, she wasn't sure, but not because she didn't want to continue. No, she absolutely did, but there were still nerves there, nerves she knew would have to be pushed through. She was pushing through it though, and as she made that clear, Blake's hesitancy seemed to fade away too. The hand on her cheek moved down to her neck and circled behind until the crook of her elbow was pulling her in deeper, while the hand on her side slipped down to grip her hip. A tongue flicked across her lips, asking for access, and Ruby gladly allowed it. It felt nice to let Blake take control. While Ruby thought she was a decent kisser, as evidenced by the fact Blake was clearly enjoying herself too, she still had trouble working out where her hands went. Did they go on Blake's stomach? Maybe too suggestive. Blake's cheek? No, Blake had a hand near her own, so the tangle of limbs would be awkward. Maybe the hip? But it was a little too far down. Her side? That seemed right. Unfortunately, as much as it seemed right, there was always stuff she couldn't plan for. Like how Blake's tops had ridden up a little with all the shifting under the blanket. As Ruby's hand landed on the target area, warm, supple skin greeted it, and a shiver ran through her girlfriend. An appreciative hum also left the faunus, and Ruby figured that she had actually done the right thing. She didn't know how long they continued like that, but Ruby definitely enjoyed herself. The careful touching, the cautious exploration, the feel of Blake's lips pressing greedily into hers, it all felt wonderful. All Ruby knew was that by the time they finally broke apart and she looked down on her breathless girlfriend, the program she had been watching had finished and a new one had started. Not that she cared, since neither of them had been paying any attention. Instead, she was looking down at her teammate and failing to suppress the happy smile that her face insisted on wearing. "We should probably head to bed." Blake chuckled as she reached up and brushed aside a lock of hair. "We have early training with Glinda tomorrow." "I know, but I'm comfy here." The girl hummed, and Ruby felt herself pushed aside as Blake's knee dropped. "Well, if you are too comfortable to move, we could just, stay on here? If you want to?" As Ruby came to a rest between her girlfriend and the back of the couch, she draped an arm across Blake's stomach and looked into the amazing amber eyes. Thoughts of her conversation with Weiss crossed her mind, where the heiress had told her the moments would present themselves, and though she had struggled to believe her partner at the time, it was easy to believe now. The moment just felt right. She was comfortable, she was warm. She was already covered in a blanket wearing her pajamas, and Blake was right next to her. It just seemed perfect. So as the grin on her face widened a little, she glanced up at her girlfriend and gave a small nod. "Sounds good," she said and bit her lip. Blake grinned and leaned in to kiss her. It was short, nowhere near as heated as their previous makeout session. More of a goodnight kiss than anything, but it made her stomach flip all the same. It was one thing to accidentally fall asleep on each other, but to actually make that choice was another. So it didn't surprise Ruby at all that, as Blake slipped her arm under her head, and she moved in to rest her head against the girl's chest, she felt her cheeks burn bright red. Chapter 33. First Steps of Progress. "Very good, Miss Rose," Professor Mulberry said as he placed Ruby's test on the desk. "Your grades are certainly improving. Finally stop being content with being top of mechanics and focusing on other areas. I like it. Thank you, sir, the Reaper replied happily. As the man walked to Yang, Blake leaned over and glanced at her girlfriend's paper. Though the score was still probably the lowest on the team, Ruby's score had definitely improved. She normally scored in the mid-30s out of 50 on most of her tests, but Blake was happy to see the redhead smiling proudly at the big, red 41. Feeling the urge to reward her, Blake gave the girl a quick kiss on the cheek that made her blush. Not bad for someone pushed ahead 2 years. She grinned as the teacher put her test on the desk. She didn't need to look to know she had scored 45. Thanks. Ruby turned and lightly pressed their lips together. While Blake would have really liked it to last longer, Mulberry gave a disapproving cough. In your own time, please, girls, he said, and turned to Weiss. Knocked out of first place for the first time, Miss Schnee. What? Her voice was shrill as she reached out and snatched the paper before it even touched their desk. With a quick glance over the era's shoulder, she saw the number 48 stamped at the top. It wasn't uncommon for the snow-haired girl to miss a few marks on her dust papers due to Professor Mulberry's tendency to throw in some extremely difficult questions, but Blake had only counted 5 such questions. Even after reading them multiple times, Blake had no idea what they were asking of her, so the fact that Weiss had got 3 of them correct was still very impressive. Who? Mr. Cole, the man said happily as he held up the paper to the class. Weiss' eyes practically burned with rage. Not quite perfect, only 49 I'm afraid, but good to finally have someone in the class who can give Miss Schnee here a challenge. Thanks, Professor, he said nonchalantly and leaned back on his chair a little. Nice curveball on 31. Almost got me. Another quick glance over Weiss' shoulder to the increasingly crumpled paper showed that 31 was one to the questions her teammate had got wrong. Before Blake could even say anything though, the girl shot Flint a filthy look and pulled a heavy book from her bag to begin going over the paper again. Knowing nothing more would be said from her for a while, Blake gave a small shrug and leaned back to talk to her own partner. So how'd you do? Yang shrugged and shoved the paper into her bag. 46, no biggie. Figured you'd be fine with that question on fire dust. 'Cause I'm super hot? Blake shook her head at the smirk on her partner's face. It still surprised her how good of a student Yang was. Though she certainly didn't act like it, the girl was always getting high marks in dust, history, and general studies, and though she always shook them off as just being naturally good grades, Blake knew Yang put a lot of effort into her work. She was also sure Velvet was helping her study too. Nevertheless, Blake finally looked at her own paper to see a solid 45. She smiled to herself as she heard the bell, her hand automatically slipping into her girlfriend's as they both rose from the desk. It had already become second nature for her to reach out whenever they began to walk, and it always made her feel just that little bit more comfortable. You coming, Weiss? Ruby asked when they saw the heiress had not followed them. However, the girl simply waved them away with her head in the book. Okay. Cheer up, Weissicle. Yang grinned and leaned against the desk. It's just 1 T. The girl was cut off as a black glyph appeared between her lips. With eyes colder than the tundra of Solitas, Weiss glared up at the blonde. Shut up, she growled. Before I remove those lips that your girlfriends love so much. The glyph was removed, and Yang stepped back. Though they all knew Weiss would never actually do such a thing, the threat was enough to let them know she was serious. So with a smile still on her face, Yang gave Weiss a swift pat on the head and walked out of the room. With a quick glance back at the girl, Ruby and Blake left too. So what are you two doing today? Library with Coco, Ruby replied. She's finally gonna talk me through a few strategies she uses. Blake saw Yang's eyes narrow a little at the meeting and couldn't help wonder why. Probably going to spar with Xanthia. Blake shrugged and stretched her arms. She finally had some free time and she's a katana user, so you know. So what I'm hearing is that you're both gonna be out of the room for a while. I suppose? Great. Yang dug into her pocket and pulled out her scroll. As she picked up her pace and moved ahead of them, Blake just picked up her words as her call was answered. Sup, babe? Got the RO. She blocked out the rest of whatever Yang was going to say. The moment they entered one of Beacon's many courtyards, Yang gave a small wave and ran out of sight. Finally alone for the first time since the movie night, but she knew it wasn't for long since they both had things to do. Nevertheless, a happy feeling rushed through her as they sat down on the bench and RWBY immediately melted into her side. I gotta leave in 5 minutes, RWBY sighed. You can't leave in 10? She asked cheekily and earned a slight chuckle from the leader. Nah, Coco is still a little annoyed about having to make Yahtzee use his semblance. Don't wanna annoy her more. Gotcha. Blake breathed in the scent of strawberries from her girlfriend's hair and leaned back. I guess 5 minutes will have to do. Sweat still beaded down Blake's forehead as she stumbled down the hallway to her room. Training with Xanthia had been more painful than she expected. The third year was probably the most proficient katana user she'd ever met, and that included Adam. Much like Blake, she dual-wielded her weapons, though had opted for a standard wakizashi and tanto, but the way she moved was almost like water. Every move flowed gracefully into the other, not that many would see her move when the flash of her weapon was blinding as it reflected off her clothes, and Blake had been in awe from the minute she first saw the girl in combat class. It was rare to find someone so taken with ninjutsu, so much so that she'd only ever met 3 others that practiced it. Which was a shame. It truly was a lost art. And an art she was eager to master, so had jumped at the chance when Xanthia approached her about training together. Though, from how her muscles ached, the body was already beginning to rebel against that decision. The past 2 hours had been spent practicing only 2 moves, but the sheer amount of precision those moves required had left her drained in both body and mind. So looking forward to collapsing on her bed, she slapped her scroll against the lock and shouldered the door open. The very first thing she saw was Yang, and Velvet laid on the couch. Though Yang was fully dressed, Velvet wore a t-shirt that clearly belonged to Yang and fell to mid-thigh, but Blake considered it lucky they had any clothes on at all. She was also thankful they had opened the window. You look exhausted. Yang chuckled as she stroked the hair of the faunus that laid across her lap. Xanthia really went hard on you, huh? You could say that again. Oh, you're training with Thea? Velvet asked excitedly. Blake simply gave her a nod. I remember when Fox trained with her. He quit after 2 sessions. Is she really that tough to keep up with? She's near the top of the school for a reason, Yang. Blake's right. Even I feel sluggish when I mimic her fighting style. Huh? Blake stumbled her way past the couch and collapsed face first on her bed, and her body immediately screamed in relief. Though her aura was already giving her back most of the energy she lost, it would still take an hour before she would be back to full. So to kill the time, she rolled over onto her back and glanced over at her partner, or more specifically the couch that the blonde was sitting on. It had been in their room for the last 3 days, and had already caused a few arguments. With the room being small, there really wasn't much room for it, and Weiss kept stubbing her toes on the corners in the morning, which would usually cause Weiss to throw what Blake could only assume were Elysian insults, from how red they made RWBY, at the blonde. Every time Yang was told to move it back downstairs though, she would simply say she was tired from training, and would do it eventually. However, from how much they all seemed to use it, she was fairly certain that was just an auto-response to placate the heiress. Blake didn't mind it though. Sure, it got in the way, but it was also great for just hanging out with RWBY without having to cuddle on one of their beds, where expectations were sure to be felt. There was also the fact that they had both spent their first night together on it, their first night where they both acknowledged they were spending it together and hadn't just fallen asleep. And despite how little room there had actually been, even with RWBY half on top of her, Blake couldn't remember waking up more comfortable in her life. And it was something she was eager to do again. Why isn't RWBY not back yet, I take it? Blake said, and shifted the pillow under her head. Nah, Yang said, and changed the channel. They've gone to Vale for something, should be back soon though. Damn. What's up? We're not good enough company for you. More like not the kind I want right now. I'll want RWBY to kiss you all better? The teasing tone made Blake roll her eyes, and even Velvet gave a small tut, though after a chuckle escaped the girl. Blake could hardly argue against the teasing without lying. It's great how close you two are becoming. I hear you have a date this weekend? Yeah. Let's just hope it doesn't end like the last one. I'll say, Yang laughed. I swear I still have that ringing in my head. Pretty sure that's just Weiss because you refused to take that couch down. It's good to cuddle on. Again, Blake couldn't disagree. As the afternoon passed and Blake felt her strength slowly recover, she engaged in idle chit-chat with her partner. There was always something about talking to Yang that Blake really liked. Though she did really enjoy her talks with RWBY, she was still hesitant to voice everything since she knew the girl liked to believe the best in people. But with Yang, there were no barriers. She could talk about how Professor Port was a little sleazy, how Oblek was likely one strong coffee away from exploding, how Cardin was still a colossal asshole. Thankfully, the boy tended to avoid their team, since they were more than willing to put him in his place. But every now and then, he got brave and tried something. With Neon starting the school though, he had tried to make her his new target. As opposed to his usual tactics, however, he was being a little more subtle. The occasional cat joke here, the occasional odd sound that people used to call their pets. However, he had seemingly got bored when she refused to respond and abandoned the subtly to drop a heavy book on her tail. The consequences had been immediate, as Cobalt had stood from his chair and promptly thrown the boy out of a nearby window. The memory of Cardin's face, just before he dropped from sight, still made Blake chuckle. After almost an hour and a half though, Blake's energy finally returned and she pushed herself off the bed and grabbed a book. With a happy sigh that she could walk again, she sat down next to Yang on the couch and settled in to read. However, it was barely 5 minutes before Yang started her usual antics.
"What you reading?"
Blake looked to her side and saw that Velvet had her eyes closed as Yang gently stroked her rabbit ears. Since she hadn't talked in almost 15 minutes, she'd likely fallen asleep.
"Nothing you would like." Try me."
An amused smirk pulled at Blake's face since she knew exactly what would happen and turned her book a little so that Yang could read it.
"What the fuck?"
Yang explained seconds later.
"What is this?" "It's called an experimental piece."
Blake chuckled.
"The author wanted to make a coherent story with as many long words as he could. Well, I think he failed."
Blake knew Minnie would say the same, but she was actually a fan of what he had done. With the exception of a few key words, there were barely any that were below 5 letters long.
"It's a little convoluted, but the story is coherent." "Coherent?"
Yang scoffed and pointed to a word.
"What the fuck does contemporary that word mean?" "Contemporaneity."
Blake laughed and finally turned the book away.
"It means something happening at the same time. The whole book is about a race trying to understand time and how to read it so they can predict outcomes." "That sounds boring."
Yang grinned and returned to the television. Though Blake knew how it would have gone from the beginning, she appreciated that Yang always tried to show an interest in her hobby, even though that interest faded very quickly. Blake was also more than happy to return the favor and usually accompany the girl on outings when asked. Although, as opposed to Yang attempts, Blake usually found herself enjoying it by the end of the night. However, she enjoyed the quiet nights reading too, so Yang, always respectful of that, turned the hollow viewer down a little. They happily sat there for a while, Blake reading, while Yang lovingly stroked her sleeping girlfriend's ears. It was nice and relaxing. Something that she hadn't really had the chance to indulge in for a while. Unfortunately, the piece was destined to only last so long since the door burst open 15 minutes later, causing Velvet to wake with a start.
"I'm BA. Ruby."
CK. Ruby's voice fell, but the damage was already done. Velvet was already wide awake, and Yang's eyes were red.
"Oops. Sorry. I told you we should have knocked first,"
Weiss said and glanced at each of them.
"I see you still haven't taken that couch back down. Kinda hard to do when we're using it."
Yang replied grumpily as Velvet sat up.
"Sorry you were woken up, babe. It's F.I.N.E.
The girl yawned.
"I shouldn't have been sleeping anyway." "Yeah, well, you clearly needed it."
With Yang and Velvet quickly diving into conversation about how Professor Green had given the second years a mountain or coursework, Blake closed her book and walked over to her girlfriend. Thankfully, Yang's scolding hadn't stuck, and she was already smiling again. In her hand was a bag that Blake immediately recognized as being from the weapons store.
"What you got there?"
she asked curiously.
"Just some things for Crescent Rose."
The Reaper grinned and detached her weapon to place it on the desk.
"As beautiful as she is, she wasn't very good against the Helk, so I've been working through some ideas for upgrades. Figured I would get it today so that I'm all yours on Saturday."
As Blake moved in closer and wrapped her arms around the girl's waist, Ruby placed the bag next to her beloved. To Minnie, the loud clunk that betrayed how heavy the bag was would have raised an eyebrow, but Blake was very aware of how much the sinister side that Ruby maneuvered so easily weighed. Still, she couldn't help but be a little curious what she had bought that could be so heavy.
"So do I get to know what this upgrade is? Or not?"
A wide grin stretched over Ruby's face
as she reached up on tiptoes to give her a brief kiss.
Nope. Okay, let me rephrase. Should I be scared of this new upgrade? Yes,
Weiss answered for her partner, who simply gave a weak smile.
Can you name anything that she hasn't blown herself up with yet?
Blake had to admit that Weiss made a very good point.
Anyway, these are for you.
Blake took the box of dust that was passed her way and opened it to see a set of dust canisters secured firmly into place. She'd been intending to pick some up on Saturday during her trip with Ruby.
Thanks. I was gonna buy some though. I had business to take care of at one of our stores anyway.
Weiss shrugged her jacket off and placed it on the back of her chair as she began to rummage in her pocket.
Save your money. Speaking of, Velvet, I have something for you too. Huh?
Both the Faunus and Yang turned to face the heiress with confusion on their faces, as Weiss extended her arm to hold out a piece of paper, which they took and read. Very slowly, their faces turned from confusion to shock, and Velvet quickly looked up and folded her ears.
I don't understand,
she said slowly.
It's the reward money from the help mission.
Weiss replied simply and turned back to fiddle with her bag.
I don't need it. Put it towards that school you want to build or something.
What?
Weiss, I can't accept this. Then I'll just give it to Coco, since I know she will.
Weiss replied firmly.
But, look.
Weiss' annoyance at indecision seemed to have reared its head again, and she turned on the Faunus.
That money will do nothing for me. I have more than enough to last my lifetime, and many more. I would rather it actually be put to some use, which I think you can do. So stop arguing, and just take it. I'd just take it.
Yang sighed and turned away.
She won't give up until you do.
Velvet still seemed conflicted, but at Yang's word, she gave a tiny nod and pocketed the check. While Velvet went about thanking Weiss, Blake looked to her partner and saw a slight frown on her features, and was pretty sure she knew what had caused it. But she didn't seem to be in the mood to talk, so Blake simply turned back to Ruby. The Reaper was the complete opposite, clearly happy to just be in her embrace, so Blake pressed a kiss against her lips before leading her to the couch. When they sat down, Velvet stood up and turned to her girlfriend with a soft smile.
I should head back to study. Got it.
Her tone was cheerful again, but Blake was getting used to telling when it was a lie.
Love ya. Love you too.
The Faunus replied and leaned down to give Yang a quick goodbye kiss.
See you later, everyone. Bye.
They all echoed. Silence filled the room when Velvet left, and Blake could feel the tension in the air as she and Ruby watched the program. Though Yang was staring at it, Ruby seemed to be the only one who hadn't sensed the girl's mood. Weiss clearly had, however, as she was purposely sorting out what she had bought from Vale for longer than she usually did. Eventually, she let out a sigh and turned to look at the blonde.
Should I not have done that? It's fine, Weiss,
Yang said dismissively, her eyes still half focused on the hollow screen.
You want to give my girlfriend money that will send her packing quicker, that's up to you. Well, what would you rather I do? Just not give it to her. I would rather you talk to me about it first. Stop arguing,
Ruby interrupted.
Yang, Weiss was trying to do something nice.
Yang's eyes, which had been tinting red, slowly turned back to violet, and she let out a sad sigh.
I'm sorry.
Weiss seemed to hesitate for a second, but she quickly relaxed.
I'm sorry too. I should have considered how that would make you feel. You did nothing wrong.
Yang breathed and looked down at her lap.
Just me and my stupid issues. Again. Your issues are far from stupid, Yang,
Blake replied and slipped an arm through her partner's.
We all know how tough these are for you. I'm sure Weiss will remember that in the future.
Though Blake wasn't angry at Weiss in the slightest, it was hard to deny that Weiss often forgot to think of others' feelings. Her lack of indecision was great most of the time, but sometimes led to her seeming rather inconsiderate. Nevertheless, they all knew she had meant well, and with Weiss giving a firm nod, she felt Ruby beckon the girl over to sit with them again.
I'm gonna grab the dust books. I want to go over the questions I got wrong,
Ruby announced and stood up as her partner sat down.
Want to show me where you put them, Blake?
It was far from subtle, but Blake smiled and joined her in walking over to the bookcase. As they were browsing, she turned her ears backwards, and after a couple of seconds heard a low sigh followed by a whisper.
I really am sorry I made you feel that way. It's fine, Weiss,
Yang replied, genuinely that time.
I shouldn't have snapped either.
Having heard what she needed to, she turned back to her girlfriend and found her eyes staring at her questioningly. Knowing what the girl was after, she offered a brief smile and saw relief flash past the Reaper's eyes. With everything seemingly back to normal, they both grabbed the books and made their way back to the couch, where Ruby sat next to Weiss and immediately opened her study material.
Put on some good background noise. You got it, sis.
Chapter 34. A Date at Last. Blake thought she looked good. The outfit wasn't anything particularly special, but the combination of a purple scarf and a black, tight-fitting combat jacket that she didn't remember having in the back of her closet really helped her amber eyes and fair skin stand out a little more. A long purple shirt peeked out from the bottom of the jacket before tucking into a pair of black jeans and knee-high boots. Despite the small splashes of color, it was simple, but Blake liked simple. She looked good and simple. So with a small smile to herself, she fluffed her hair a little and turned around slowly to check out every angle. While it wasn't hers and Ruby's first date, or even their second, she still wanted to make a good impression. Partly because it was a little different than the others. It was the first actual date as an actual couple. Sure, there had been small outings and patrols on Patch, but something about going to the movies and then hanging out in town for the entire afternoon felt different. There was also the fact that it was their third, and though Blake certainly didn't expect that, she knew they would both likely be aware of what usually happened on third dates. Although, she wasn't quite sure about nothing happening. Though she definitely didn't expect anything to happen, it was undeniable that their relationship had taken a few steps forward as of late. There had been a lot more cuddling, not that there wasn't a lot already, and more than a few of the cuddling sessions had been taking place on the bed, or the couch that, much to Weiss' annoyance, was still in the room. When other people were around, it simply remained cuddling, but when they weren't it often became more. Never anything too much, but definitely more intimate than anything had been done on Patch. Even as she thought about it, she remembered them relaxing on the bed reading a book, only for it to turn into them making out. But Ruby had taken to partially climbing on top of her recently, not completely, but enough to where gravity forced their bodies together. She could still remember how that felt, how it sent her heart racing, and how her hands wanted to roam a little more than they did. She was still holding back a little, as she felt Ruby wasn't ready for that, but it was getting harder and harder to.
Ollie!
The shout had interrupted her thoughts, and made her jump in place. As she turned around, she wasn't sure if her heart racing was due to the jump scare, or because of where her mind had wandered. From the blush she glimpsed as she turned to face her partner, she was guessing a little at both.
Get out of here!
Yang was sitting on the desk with her legs crossed facing the open window, which she was throwing empty shell casing out of. She had been meditating for the past 15 minutes, but she usually went for longer, so Blake hadn't expected to hear a word from her for a while. However, it wasn't the first time she had seen her partner do such a thing, and couldn't help but chuckle at the sight.
Ravens again?
She asked as Yang jumped off the desk and closed the window, though not before Blake heard a squawk.
Fucking birds! Haven't let me alone since I was a kid,
Yang said with a little annoyance.
Interrupting my damn quiet time.
Yang stopped as they caught each other's eye, and gave her a quick glance up and down.
Looking good, Blakey. Ruby'll love it. Thanks.
She felt her cheeks warm, and fluffed her hair again.
One thing though.
The blonde leaned down to dig into her drawer, but emerged within seconds with something in her hand.
Turn around.
Blake wasn't sure what Yang was going to do, but she trusted her partner to not be playing a prank, though not enough to squint suspiciously at her before turning. The feeling of Yang's hands high on her thigh made her flinch at first, but she quickly relaxed and felt something tighten around her leg. When the blonde was done, Blake looked down to see a belt strapped around her upper leg, the dark leather forcing the jeans to cling just that little bit tighter.
There we go,
the girl said proudly and slung an arm around Blake's shoulder.
Show off that fantastic bell booty a little more. Thanks, I guess,
Blake said with a skeptical glance at her partner, though she wasn't opposed since the extra tightness was at least a little more comforting.
It's true. Even velvet looks every now and again. Okay, well, my ass aside.
Blake smiled and pushed her friend away.
How do I look?
Yang crossed her arms and surveyed her for a second before a mischievous grin overtook her features.
Perfect. Why do I talk to you? Because you love me? You make it very difficult sometimes.
A light punch was delivered to her arm, and Blake let out a soft laugh at her friend's stupidity. Had anyone else made such a joke, Blake would have likely been rather annoyed, but Yang felt different. Sure, she was joking about her having cat features, but it never felt malicious, or like there was any judgment there. It always felt like how she made puns with Weiss' name, or how Weiss would tease her for being blonde. It always felt like it came from a friendly place, so Blake really didn't mind the occasional joke.
Anyway, I should get going.
Blake smiled and picked up her wallet.
We're cutting it close already, and I've still got to pick up Ruby from the workshop. Yeah, she is super happy about whatever she is doing with that scythe. Tell me about it.
Blake grinned. From what Blake could tell, the only person who knew what the Reaper was up to with her weapon was Weiss, but the girl had refused to tell either of them. Blake didn't mind, of course, since she just had fun watching her girlfriend mess around.
Well, I'm off. Have a good day in the dark cinema.
Yang replied with a wink that made Blake blush. With a shake of her head, Blake pulled the door open and gave her best friend a quick wave before heading out to collect Ruby. Blake already lost interest in the movie. While it certainly wasn't bad, it was such a tonal shift from the first that she simply couldn't get into it. Instead of going with the carefully constructed plot they had in the first, they had simply opted for the sequel to take place in a fictional huntsman academy. While it was a natural progression for the characters, the lack of danger and stakes made it rather mundane. So instead of the movie, Blake turned her attention to her beautiful girlfriend instead. Thankfully, while the first movie had garnered somewhat of a cult following, it hadn't received too much attention. It was so little, in fact, that the sequel wasn't even being shown in major theaters, but smaller ones. But Blake liked that. Instead of the usual individual chairs, the theater had a few couches and tables that allowed people to sit together. It also allowed for couples to cuddle, with Ruby having taken advantage of the latter not even a second after the movie started. It had just been simply hand-holding at first, but after a couple of minutes, the girl's legs had tucked underneath her and Blake had felt a pressure on her shoulder. More than happy to oblige, she'd wrapped an arm around her warm shoulders and nestled into the embrace. As soon as her attention faltered, she decided to focus on the smaller things about Ruby. Her breathing, the chuckles when something funny happened, the way her hand still refused to leave hers. It all felt nice, though it was still a little hard to believe she'd found something so peaceful after years of violence, but she had. So feeling a little mischievousness creep in, she pressed her lips into the girl's cheek and earned a giggle in return. As the silver eyes looked up at her, she stuck out her tongue and offered the popcorn. Even if the movie wasn't her thing, simply spending time with Ruby definitely was.
Aw, that was so much better than the first. The weapons were so much cooler.
I'm glad he kept the shotgun shovel though. Blake blocked her eyes from the harsh light that tried to blind her as they walked out of the theater. Adjusting to light after her night vision had taken full effect was always a little annoying since it usually left her with a slight headache, but she happily threw her girlfriend a soft smile.
It certainly had better production quality,
she agreed, but earned a suspicious look from Ruby.
You didn't like it? I did, kind of,
Blake said with a chuckle.
Just felt different. We didn't really need a continuation, and it felt like they forgot what made the first so good and chose to follow trends instead. Oh my
Ruby exclaimed, taking a step in front of her and pointing a finger accusingly.
You're a hipster.
Blake couldn't help but laugh at the stupid accusation. Growing up on the outskirts of Mistral, it was hard not to know what that word meant. With the kingdom being so full of art and music, it was practically inevitable that an entire subculture revolving around people who liked less mainstream stuff would arise. In Blake's experience, though they were mostly annoying snobs, though she'd be lying if she said that wasn't most people in Mistral anyway, but though she knew many aspects of her personality aligned with that group, she had never particularly felt a kinship with them. For her, it was all about what she liked, and she liked what felt real. But the very unfortunate thing about trends was that many of them were incredibly far removed from real. Stories of couples living in comfort, of average, everyday people saving the world from grim, along with stories of aliens and zombies. Those kinds of things just didn't appeal to her. Though, of course, she understood why they were popular. They gave people hope, or something to distract them. Anything to take away from the perpetual fear that lay beneath the surface of every single person on Remnant. So unlike said hipsters of Mistral that she'd met in her travels, she never really judged people for liking what they liked.
Hardly,
she replied happily, and took her girlfriend's hand as they made their way down the street.
I just preferred the first. It felt more desperate, more like they were genuinely trying to survive their village being attacked. The improved weapons and choreography felt like they just wanted to make a typical superhero movie. MHM, that sounds very hipster.
Ruby grinned mischievously and stuck out her tongue.
And what would a little goth know about hipsters, huh?
She teased back and received a gasp in response.
I'm totally not small. I'm taller than Weiss is in heels. That isn't hard.
Another gasp.
Mean it. I'm gonna tell her you said that. Going to get her to bite my ankles?
As much as Blake joked, she had no doubt that Weiss would win a fight between them.
I'm not that mean.
The redhead grinned and moved a little closer to avoid other people as they walked down the street.
Besides, I don't think even I could get her to bite someone. I can just imagine her face now if you asked her to.
The team leader let out a snort and straightened her posture as she put on her best impression of her partner's voice.
How dare you ask me, why Schnee, to put my perfectly white teeth anywhere near someone's foot?
Blake couldn't contain her laughter at the overly fancy tone in which the Reaper had mocked her partner, mostly because it actually sounded rather good, though that was to be expected since they spent most of their time together. She was still a little surprised that Ruby had managed to get the heiress to spend so much time in the workshop though.
Perfect impression.
She giggled and bumped the girl with her shoulder.
Though you better not let her hear you say that. Had true,
Ruby said with a happy smile on her face.
She'll probably beat me with a Beowulf. She's been a little on edge again lately. The test thing again? Yeah, she's a little worried her father is gonna find out she isn't the top of dust class anymore.
Blake felt a small pang of sympathy for their teammate. She knew the only reason Weiss was able to attend Beacon was because her father allowed it. She also knew that despite there being an ocean between the two, the man still exerted an extremely annoying amount of control over Weiss' life. He was constantly calling and requesting updates, but Blake didn't believe for a second that he couldn't get them anyway if Weiss lied. Nor would she put it past him to try and pull her from the school if she wasn't doing well in her classes. It was part of the reason she always gave Weiss a pass for being rather grumpy during intense study sessions.
I definitely don't envy her,
Blake hummed.
But Flint really does know his stuff. Yeah, he seems to really get under Weiss' skin. I can see why though,
Blake reasoned as they entered a small bakery.
Flint might put a lot of work into learning all he can, but he still seems to be very easygoing. I think that bugs Weiss due to just how much effort she puts in herself and still struggles to express herself. He's kind of like a version of her that didn't have Jacques as a father. And she hates him for that? I wouldn't say she hates him.
Blake shrugged as Ruby began to check out the multitude of cookies.
More that it annoys her that she can't be like that. Any 10, please,
she said to the girl behind the counter and motioned to all the cookies before turning back.
But she is like that,
the leader said confidently.
She's really fun when you know her. I know that. But that's only around us. Even around JNPR, even Ran, she is still pretty guarded. Kind of like me, I guess. But Flint is easygoing with everyone while doing better than her in some areas that she is supposed to be a specialist in. I can see how that stings. I guess I never thought of it that way.
Ruby reached out to take the small basket that was handed to her and tucked it under one arm. As they both made their way out of the store again, Blake felt Ruby's hand slip into her own and looked down to see her girlfriend was quietly thinking to herself. She knew just how much Ruby cared for Weiss, since she felt the same way about Yang, and the fact that she may have not quite understood something seemed to bother her. So in an attempt to bring her out of it, Blake squeezed her hand.
I'm sure you'll help her work it out,
she said in a reassuring voice.
You always bring out the best in her. You think so? I don't think Weiss would have been able to get where she is now if you weren't her friend.
Blake confirmed with a nod and earned a smile in return.
So where are we going next? Just want to drop these off.
Ruby shuffled the cookies slightly.
Then we can go and get something to eat. Then I will replace your boots. Sounds like a plan.
Blake smiled as Ruby started to walk again. It took them 15 minutes for them to finally reach wherever Ruby had taken them. While not completely out of the city center, it was bordering the edge where houses and hostels seemed more frequent than shops. Most were the same dull gray brick that seemed to be exceedingly common in Vale, but there were a few that were painted red and slightly taller than the others. Following Ruby towards down the street, they turned a corner and Blake was greeted by a house in the distance that stood out from the rest. Only one story and painted navy blue, it looked extremely out of place. As they walked towards it, she felt a sense of unease at just how dark and different it looked, and couldn't help but inquire.
Why is that one different?
Ruby turned to look at her with a slight amount of surprise on her face, but it quickly faded to realization and her face fell slightly.
It's a grieving house,
Ruby replied quietly, almost like she was trying to be respectful.
when someone is in mourning but lives close to the wall, they move into one for a while. They're spaced out all over Vale, so that there isn't just one place giving off negative energy and attracting grim. They're marked blue so that people know to be respectful to those who stay there. I didn't know Vale did such a thing.
Blake breathed, now knowing why the houses around it were so dull. It sucked to be mourning a loss, but to see everything around you be so happy and bright only made that loss harder.
It helps keep people safe and stops Grim attacking one spot for weeks,
Ruby said plainly. Blake couldn't refute that. Kingdom walls were hard enough to defend already, but letting grieving people live near them would make the Grim attack all the more. With her question answered though, Blake remained silent for the rest of the walk to the door of the house. She heard voices inside before Ruby even knocked, but the conversation being held felt forced. She knew all too well the sound of someone who just wanted to be left alone, and whoever was living in the house seemed to want that more than anything. However, the voices quickly cut out as Ruby raised a hand to knock, and a woman in a purple lounge dress with silver hair answered the door. Blake recognized her immediately as the mother from the funeral who had been weeping over her daughter's coffin.
"Hello, Mrs. Matt,"
Ruby said, a gentleness to her tone that reminded Blake why she liked Ruby so much.
"I hope you don't mind, but we were in the area and wanted to see how you are." "That's kind of you, Ruby."
Despite the small smile on the woman's face, her voice was hollow and empty.
"We are doing about as well as can be expected."
Clearly Ruby understood the meaning as much as Blake did, and gave a respectful nod.
"I'm sorry we couldn't do more to help you. You let us bury our daughter in peace,"
Mrs. Matt replied with a shake of her head.
"You did more than enough. Pearl would be grateful. I would invite you in, but I'm afraid I'm not very good company at the moment." "I understand,"
Ruby said kindly.
"We have some things to take care of anyway. But we brought you these. It's not much, but I know Pearl liked cookies."
Ruby held out the basket with a soft smile, and after a couple of seconds Linda reached out to take it. As the woman's arm extended, Blake saw a silver glint and looked down to see the bracelet she had retrieved from the lake around the woman's wrist.
"That's very sweet."
The smile on her face was half-hearted at best, but Ruby didn't seem to care.
"Well, we should leave you in peace,"
the Reaper said and took a step backwards.
"I hope you feel better soon, Mrs. Matt."
After the woman gave a small nod, the two gave a small wave and turned to walk away. However, they only made it halfway down the path before a voice was heard behind them.
"Excuse me?"
They both turned to see the woman had stepped out of the house.
"What was your name?"
Her eyes were directly on Blake, and she felt her pulse quicken a little.
"Blake. Blake Belladonna, ma'am." "Blake?"
she said after a moment and reached to twist the beads on her wrist.
"So that is the name of the girl who returned my daughter's most prized possession to me."
Tears welled in the woman's head, and she bent at the hip into a small bow.
"I cannot express how much it means to have this little piece of her with me again. Thank you, Miss Belladonna."
Blake was stunned. She'd never been thanked in such a way before. Even in the White Fang when they would free captives, they were usually gone before any gratitude could be exchanged, so to be thanked in such a way left her lost for words. It felt oddly good. Like, for the first time in her life, she had done something she could be proud of. It wasn't huge or world-changing, but she had made someone's life a little better. So wanting to express how happy she was to have done such a thing, she straightened her back and gave a soft smile to the woman opposite her.
"You don't need to thank me, Mrs. Matt,"
she kindly, and gave a small bow in return.
"I'm just happy I could help in some way."
Both of them raised back to their full heights and shared a look, but the woman quickly turned away and walked back into the house. For some reason though, the moment lingered in her memory, even as she felt Ruby's hand slip into her own and turned to continue back towards the town center. Blake let out a happy sigh as she finished the green tea and threw the cup into a nearby trash can. Lunch had been delicious, though sushi usually was, and to her surprise, Ruby had actually eaten it too. Usually the girl was a little fussy and preferred to eat junk food whenever she had a day off from their usual routine meals, but the girl had actually strayed from her norm and tried the food. Even more surprisingly, she had liked it too. Not only had the girl finished most of her first order, but had enthusiastically tried most of what Blake gave her, though she had immediately shot down the jellyfish and squid. Nevertheless, it had been a lot of fun teaching Ruby about the different types of sushi and watching her turn a deep scarlet when she tried the wasabi had made her laugh more than she had in some time. When they had finished though, the server had given them some green tea to go, and they had aimlessly walked around town just looking for things to do. The first had been a little store that sold trinkets and supposed Grimm talismans made from real Grimm bone. It was obviously fake, since Grimm always evaporated when they died, but she guessed there was always someone willing to buy such a thing. Numerous other windows had been looked in, from weapon shops to bookstores, which Ruby had bought a new study pad from, but they had finally arrived somewhere for them to stop for a while. A mission board.
Still not there, huh?
Blake asked as Ruby looked it up and down.
Nope,
she said, and looked closer at the completed missions.
It updates every 2 weeks, so we'll probably be there by Monday. I guess we'll be the talk of the school on Monday then. I guess so. I'm just happy it's dead.
The Reaper shrugged.
I would love to take up some of these though. Well, 6 more months, and we can take up however many we want. Kind of.
Blake smiled and bumped her girlfriend.
I can't wait. Shame we won't be able to take up anything higher than 2 stars though. So long as we don't have another help for a while, I'm fine with 2 stars. True.
Ruby laughed as they turned away from the mission board.
But next time we go up against something like that, we are definitely going to be ready. No luck needed.
Blake squeezed her girlfriend's hand to show her support as they made their way back down the street. With how much Ruby had been dedicating to her studying and training, she didn't doubt for a second the validity of that statement. Even she herself was putting in more effort, and she knew that Weiss and Yang were doing the same. And not just as a team, but individually too.
Well,
she grinned down at the girl.
So long as we have you as our leader, I'm sure we'll become the best huntstresses to ever graduate Beacon. Aw yeah. Team RWBY gonna save the world.
A pleasant warmth ran through Blake and warmed her against the cold winds as a chuckle emanated from the young Reaper. The sound never failed to make her smile, and she had been trying her best to hear it a little more often. Thankfully, Yang was often around to make the girl laugh too. More idle talk passed between them, simple discussion about lessons and teachers, training and other students. As usual, Ruby found a way to bring it around to weapons, and they resumed their discussion about the movie and the weapons that had been used in it. Even she had to agree with her girlfriend that they were better and more suited for Grimm slaying, but she still countered with the fact the haphazardly constructed weapons in the first film were more suited to their situation. The back and forth continued all the way to the mall, but when they slipped inside, they both let out a small breath of relief as warm, strawberry-scented air rushed over her. Despite it being rather busy in the shopping center, the warmth it offered was a worthy trade.
So,
Blake said as Ruby jumped forward.
Soup? Clingers? Or Foxglove? Or maybe you want to visit Romans again?
Ruby blushed a deep red, and Blake smirked at the memory.
I'm joking. I know.
The girl giggled, sticking out her tongue.
We got a lot for the mission, so I'm thinking soup. Maybe Foxglove for a hoodie or 2. Sounds good to me. We can look into clingers too if you want,
Blake said, and received a nod as they both set off towards the first store.
Why is a clothing store called Soup anyway? No idea.
Ruby shrugged.
Yang just laughs and says I wouldn't understand when I ask. Fair enough.
A few minutes later, they were standing in the middle of the soup, browsing through the clothing racks with a smile on their faces. The store was one of the best in Vale, and Blake knew for a fact that it was where Coco bought a lot of her regular clothes from. There were 2 very distinct parts of the store, one that revolved more around expensive designer clothes, and a section that was quite a bit more eccentric. It was the later part that they were happily browsing through.
What about this?
Ruby said and held up a green t-shirt with a black manticore on it.
Ignore the color, they can change that. Don't products with Grimm on them feel a little off to you?
She chuckled as the Reaper pressed the shirt against her chest.
Nah.
The girl scoffed dismissively, but put the shirt back and pulled another from a nearby rack.
What about this?
Blake inspected the blue t-shirt covered in white roses and gave a thumbs up. After receiving a smile from the leader, Blake returned to skimming through her own rack and pulling out what looked to be a band t-shirt. A drawing of a girl with long flowing hair stood screaming into a mic, the word Nevermore stretching out from a nearby speaker. It spoke to her for some reason, and she turned to show it to Ruby.
That would look so good on you,
she explained and reached over to touch the girl on the shirt.
She kinda looks like you. A little?
She chuckled as she threw it into her basket and searched for more things to try on. 40 minutes later, Blake was standing in the changing room, looking at herself in the mirror. It was undeniable that her body was honed to perfection. Lean muscle covered her body, her stomach was firm enough to bounce a lean card off of, her arms were strong and a little larger than average, though not too much. But there were also scars. So many scars. Deep gashes from where she had caught herself running out of burning buildings, cuts and scratches from fights with Grimm and humans alike. One scar stood out more prominently than the others though. A thin, white line that went from her bottom left rib to her hip. She would never forget the day she got it, never forget that she had been so scared that her semblance had presented itself. It had been the first time he raised his hand, the first time he'd been so angry. She remembered knocking the weapons rack as she fell, how their swords had fallen and the pain that had followed.
You dressed yet?
Ruby's voice dragged her from the thoughts. In truth, they weren't as bad as they had once been. They certainly didn't feel good, but while it took a lot of effort, she could feel herself slowly moving on from those days. And being with Ruby certainly helped with that. Even as she thought of the brunette, she saw a smile pull at her lips of her mirror self.
Yeah, 1 second.
Quickly pulling a simple black shirt over her head that had ribbon weaved up the sleeves, she gave herself a quick check in the mirror and turned to walk out of the changing room.
I'm not sure about this one. The ribbons feel like too much.
Ruby walked over and flicked one.
Yeah, definitely too much. The rest looks nice though. I could get Coco to adjust it for me. But then I may as well just buy a plain black top. True. Yes, this one is a no. Next.
With a roll of her eyes and a smile, Blake turned away and walked back into the changing room with a slight sway to her hips. However, before she could close the curtain, she looked in the mirror and saw her girlfriend's eyes flick down for a split second for the second time that day. She was still wearing the same jeans with the belt strap around her thigh as when she'd left the house, and Ruby clearly liked the look. She made a mental note to thank Yang when they got back to the dorm. There were only a few more tops for her to try on, but only 2 were accepted, the first being the band t-shirt, and the second being a blue tank top with a shuriken soaring along it and leaving a trail of white behind it. However, as she got to the last one, Blake felt a mischievous grin etch itself on her face. She had picked it up while Ruby wasn't looking, but had been undecided as to whether she was going to try it on or not. She knew what it was based off of, but had never actually seen anyone wear them, though with what it was, that was hardly surprising. But did she dare try it on and show Ruby? The look on her girlfriend's face would definitely be a sight to behold, but was it too far? Was the teasing a little too much? As she thought on those things though, she remembered how Ruby had talked about it being okay to try and push things a little further. It wasn't like Blake was trying to coax the girl or anything, but surely a little teasing was harmless. So with that thought in mind, she pulled off the previous top that had received a no and her bra, and set about putting on the new one. It took a little adjusting, but after a minute, she finally got it into position and looked in the mirror. It was definitely risque. While everything was covered, it definitely left little to the imagination. The black fabric only really covered her front, with her back left almost entirely exposed. The only parts that reached all the way around were the neck and the hem so that it could stay on. With such a large gap, even the sides of the fabric was a little lacking so as to purposely show off a generous amount of her breasts. It was nowhere near enough to be indecent, but it was definitely provocative enough to make Blake question revealing herself to her girlfriend.
Are you sure you want to see this last one? She asked nervously. It's a little different to the others. It's a top. How different could it be? All right,
Blake replied and turned away from the mirror, catching a glimpse of just how much the top left exposed and feeling her cheeks warm.
Don't say I didn't warn you.
With a deep breath, Blake reached out and slowly pulled the curtain aside. Ruby was busy looking at her own t-shirt at first, so Blake clasped her hands behind her back and waited for the girl to look up with a massive blush on her face. It only took a couple of seconds.
All right, what is that?
Ruby's hand came up to cover her eyes, and Blake looked at the ground and suppressed a grin at the reaction. With having actually taken a step outside and shown herself, Blake found her nerves ebb away slowly. It felt like the biggest hurdle was passed, so with a feigned innocence, she looked back up and gave the Reaper a curious look.
I found it on the rack and thought it looked nice,
she said, trying to keep her voice as even as she could.
Does it look bad? And no. It looks.
Ruby's hand came down, but her eyes darted around the room, clearly trying not to look where Blake knew she wanted to.
"It looks good?" she asked and took a step forward. "Why, yes,"
the girl stammered, and Blake felt the grin finally succeed in taking over her face.
"Very jigu.
Ruby." She bent down and reached out to place a finger on her girlfriend's chin and centered her gaze on her.
"Why, yes."
With a mischievous glint in her eye, Blake leaned in and pressed their lips together. Ruby was clearly surprised at first, but she caught up very quickly and responded. For a couple of seconds, they simply stood there and shared the moment, but Blake could sense Ruby's arms moving and reached out to meet them. Very slowly, they trailed down her girlfriend's strong arms until she felt the back of her hands, and with care, pulled them onto her hips, where the bare flesh was exposed. The touch was like electric coursing through her. They had touched before, but it was always accidental and quickly corrected, but this time Ruby's hands lingered and made no attempt to move. From the heavy breath that the Reaper expelled, she was clearly feeling something too, and Blake was happy to know she may not have done something that was too much. However, their fun suddenly came to an end when the door opened and another woman walked into the area. Though she barely gave them a second look before disappearing into a changing room, the moment had been broken and Blake pulled back to smile down at her girlfriend, whose hands were still on her hips.
"Sorry, FTH. I wasn't,"
Ruby breathed, her face bright red as her fingers twitched.
"I."
Ruby's voice was so quiet that even Blake couldn't quite make it out properly, but she was fairly sure she knew what had been said.
"Sorry,"
she smirked.
"Didn't quite catch that last bit."
Ruby's silver eyes glanced into hers, and Blake saw hesitancy, but it soon faded to resolve.
"I like the top,"
she said in one short breath.
"Oh."
Blake couldn't help but be amused.
"So I should buy it?"
The girl turned an even deeper shade of scarlet as she nodded, and Blake felt a rush of adrenaline pump through her. She had only intended to tease, not to buy, but if Ruby liked it that much, then she was certainly willing to spend the lien. So after giving the girl another fleeting kiss, she pulled back and gave her girlfriend a seductive smile.
"I guess I have to find room for 3 tops in my drawer then,"
she said with a small chuckle and walked back into the changing room. Yet again, she saw Ruby glance at her as she walked away, and purposely added some sway to her hips that caused the girl to blush wildly and turn away. By the time she finally closed the curtain, Blake could barely contain her laughter.
"Guess what I've got?"
Blake looked around at her girlfriend, who had disappeared into the aisles of clingers 5 minutes ago. A mischievous grin was on her face as she held her hands behind her back, and Blake gave her a cautious look. Just like whenever Yang did the same thing, she knew there could be practically anything behind the Reaper's back, so called on past experience to take a shot in the dark.
A corset?
Nope.
Cookies?
It was always a possibility.
Nope. One more try.
Blake glanced around the shop, her eyes seeking the direction Ruby had come from. Unfortunately, she hadn't actually seen which aisle she'd made her way down, but as luck would have it, there was a mirror that was half pointed at the leader. Through it, she could see some frills, and what looked to be a short hem. With Clingers being a shop full of dresses, she immediately knew what it was and resisted the urge to playfully roll her eyes.
A combat skirt?
Yeep. From behind her back, she produced a small black combat skirt with purple highlights. The fact that it was a combat skirt immediately made her a little hesitant, but she remembered somewhat agreeing to try one on at some point.
"You want me to try it on?"
she asked with a slightly squint.
"You did promise." "I remember saying maybe,"
she replied teasingly.
"But I suppose I'm not fighting anything, so what could it hurt?"
A happy smile stretched over Ruby's face as Blake reached out to take the skirt, and the simple action made the prospect of trying on the loose fabric worthwhile. So after reaching out to take it, they both made their way to the changing rooms. A couple of minutes later, Blake was already regretting her decision. Never before had a piece of fabric felt so uncomfortable. The way the frills tickled her thighs, the way it shifted with every slight movement she made, the way it puffed out and made her look like a ballerina. Everything about it felt uncomfortable, and she had no idea how Ruby and Weiss wore them all the time. But Ruby was eager to see it, so as stupid as she thought she looked, she walked slowly out of the stall to where her girlfriend should have been waiting. But she wasn't. Blake had stalled for a good couple of minutes, and Ruby was only trying on a dress, so should have been ready ages ago. But there she stood, in an empty waiting area.
"Ruby?" Ah, 1 minute. You okay? Ye.
Ruby's nervous voice cut off.
Kinda, maybe. I just can.
Stupid laces. Blake's eyes widened a little. She had no idea what dress Ruby was trying on, but the mention of laces sent her mind spiraling down all the possibilities.
You think you could help? What?
Blake felt herself flush. The little teasing earlier had been one thing, but to go into the stall while her girlfriend was changing was another thing altogether. Sure, it sounded like she was partially dressed, but it would still be rather intimate.
Are you sure you need to do the laces? It'll be loose and look horrible otherwise.
Blake definitely heard the hint of nervousness in the Reaper's voice, but she was clearly intent on making the dress look right. Not one to like disappointing the excitable girl, Blake took a deep breath and walked towards the stall. Her hand settled on the curtain for a good couple of seconds as she weighed up whether or not she should actually go in. On one hand, she definitely wanted to. It would be a lie to say that the fact of potentially half-naked Ruby, as low as those odds were, lay behind the curtain didn't make her want to rip the curtain down, but there was also the fact that it was going to be tough to contain herself. As much as her mind liked to imagine it being more, Ruby was undeniably in some state of undress, and she knew how difficult it would be to resist the urge to change that, and not in the way Ruby was asking for. However, Ruby wanted her help, and as difficult as it would be to resist her urges, she wasn't going to let her girlfriend's plea go unanswered. So with yet another deep breath, she prepared for whatever awaited her.
Okay,
she said, and slowly slid the curtain aside.
I'm coming in.
What greeted her wasn't what she was expecting at all. Thankfully, Ruby was almost entirely covered in what the Reaper would normally call a combat dress. Though she could only see it from the back, Blake could already tell she liked it. The soft red material was covered in black roses, their stems weaving together to create a complex pattern over the entire thing that kept the attention of whoever laid eyes on it. The bottom was filled with frill and ran a little long at the back to cover the girl's knees, but from the way the hem rose around the side, Blake could easily assume it only came up to mid-thigh at the front. The top was interesting though. Compared to the flowing frills and tail at the bottom, the top half looked like it should be rather tight, except the back hung open to expose the pale flesh it should be clinging to. Steeping slightly to the side, she saw that the chest had a crisscross pattern of red ribbons, which were flanked by a seam of black lace that hinted at the skin underneath and ran down to two veils that hung over the hips. The only thing actually holding the whole thing up, though, was the two thin straps that were visible on Ruby's shoulders.
Blake?
Ruby's voice brought her back to the present, and she realized she'd been staring with her mouth slightly agape. The dress was wonderful, and seemed suited perfectly for both Ruby's standard dress sense and combat alike.
Sorry.
She stuttered and moved forward.
How do you want me to tie it?
Just fasten the top, Ruby breathed.
I can change the laces when we get back. Kay.
Very carefully, Blake reached out and took the two ends in her hands. As she did, she felt her fingertips graze Ruby's back and heard a small intake of breath from the girl. Heat began to rise to her cheeks as she fastened the laces, and she couldn't help but chastise herself. She'd been so confident earlier when she teased Ruby, but that had been because she knew that's all it would have been. And while she still knew nothing would be happening, the intimacy of the enclosed space was definitely making her have some thoughts. Thankfully, though, the job didn't take too long, but with the lace fastened and the dress secured, a new problem presented itself. The top half was tighter than she had originally, though, and every curve was accentuated.
As so?
Ruby asked nervously.
How's it look? It looks.
Blake couldn't help but take a step closer and leaned over the girl's shoulder, the smell of the strawberry shampoo filling her nose.
Really, really good. You sure?
She felt Ruby step back until their bodies were pressed together.
It's a little more flashy than I normally wear.
That it was. As she looked over the girl's shoulder into the mirror, she could see that the lace beside the ribbon exposed a little more skin than she'd seen while it was loose. The creamy skin beneath was clearly visible, as was the slight curve of the side of Ruby's breast. Again, her body acted on its own and her hand came up to rest on the Reaper's hip.
Very sure,
she breathed.
You look wonderful.
Goo. Ruby's voice faded to a small hiss. The temptation had been too much. The smell, the warmth, the contact, it had all been just a little too much for her to resist. Her lips had found their way to Ruby's neck, and a light kiss was placed just below the girl's ear. She remembered the first time she'd done it had been as a joke during training when they'd both fallen to the floor, and it had just been something they had done from then on, but it had never quite felt how it did in that moment. The kiss didn't feel like enough. Blake wanted to sink her teeth gently into the supple flesh she could feel on her lips. However, as little control as she had enough to resist that.
Sorry,
Blake breathed, though she wasn't sorry in the slightest. To her surprise, Ruby didn't respond. Instead, a hand came to cover her own, and the girl's head tilted slightly to the side. Blake wasn't stupid, and immediately recognized it as an invitation. One that she was happy to accept. In an instant, her lips resumed the pressure on the girl's neck, and her ears picked up on a soft hum that escaped from the redhead's own lips. After a couple of seconds, though, the leader's head fell back, and Blake trailed her kisses up her jawline, up her cheek, until... The moment their lips met, Ruby let out a low groan and skillfully twisted in place. An arm was slung around the back of Blake's neck and pulled her deeper into the affection, and she wrapped her hands around Ruby's waist in response. They were against the wall in seconds, their lips mashed together as deep breaths escaped them. It felt good, great even, to be giving in to her desires. Even if it was only a little, it was still more than she had allowed in the past. As Ruby's hand slipped into her hair and seized a handful, Blake let her own slip down the dress to land on her girlfriend's thigh. Though she was not going to let it go any higher, the firm muscles beneath her fingers felt good. The girl had chosen not to wear tights, and Blake couldn't help but feel thankful for that. The smooth skin, the strong muscle, the feeling of Ruby slowly starting to pant into her mouth all had her head almost spinning as her mind started to fog over.
Black,
the girl said in the very brief moments that she had to breathe.
People might be wait. Let them.
Her words came out as more of a growl than anything human, and she moved her hand to find Ruby's. It barely took a second to find, and she quickly placed it onto her hip. She wanted to give Ruby control, wanted to let the girl decide where it went, so left it there and moved her hand up to plant it on the wall. It didn't move though, simply staying on her hip, but as the redhead's other hand slowly unwound from her hair and moved down to grab her jacket, Blake felt herself pulled in as a tongue invaded her mouth. It was then that the hand finally moved. It was slow, agonizingly slow, but it did begin to move down. Inch by inch, the fingers pulled the limb along her back with careful caution, but the moment they reached their goal, Blake let out a small gasp and felt her fingers dig into the wall. With the stall only being a flimsy plaster board and her having spent years of her life training, they went straight through. Unfortunately, it was that crunching noise that finally broke them apart. She looked down as the parted to see the Reaper was breathing so heavily that the ribbon stretched tightly across her chest looked just about ready to tear, and couldn't help but chuckle. It was good to know that Ruby had been just as into it as she had been.
Too much?
It was the usual question Blake asked after they took each new step, but it was one that she thought was important. Thankfully, Ruby looked up with her spectacular silver eyes and bit her lip while giving a small shake of her head.
Okay,
she smiled.
I am.
Something glinted in the girl's eyes, and it immediately set Blake's mind back to whenever Yang pulled a prank on someone.
I thought you'd like the dress?
Realization hit her.
You didn't need help, did you?
The huntress shook her head and failed to hide a grin.
You teased me earlier. It was mean, so I had to have a little revenge.
Blake was grinning now too. The fact that Ruby was trying to tease her too was enough to send a rush of excitement through her. Though it definitely wasn't all she was after, it would be a lie to say she wasn't excited for what that meant the future would surely hold.
Well then.
She laughed and gave the girl another short kiss, then earned her a small moan.
You should tease me more often. But yes, I do really like the dress.
Good. She smiled happily.
But as much as I love combat skirts, I don't think they suit you.
No,
they definitely don't. I should take it off.
A wicked grin spread on her face, and Ruby turned a deeper scarlet as she understood the implication.
I in your stall?
Don't worry, Blake chuckled.
I don't intend for that.
She kissed the girl again.
Yet. You're teasing again. You started it. How? By being so irresistible.
The girl's eyes widened a little, but quickly softened and another kiss was shared. It was much gentler than the other, and the intent behind it was clear. It made her stomach flutter, and her smile turn into a smirk as they finally pulled apart, though only because Ruby's hand on her chest pushed her away.
You should go get changed,
Ruby said softly, and peeled herself off the wall.
We still have to go to Foxglove for a new hoodie, since my last one was melted. I remember.
Blake laughed and made her way to the curtain. A quick peek outside showed that there was no one out there.
We should be quick though. Last airship is in 40 minutes. Will do.
With one last smile back at the girl, who made her happier than she had any right being, Blake left the stall and returned to her own to get dressed. As she did, she thought on how good what had just happened felt, and found her heart begin to race again. She had no idea why Ruby affected her so much, but she certainly wasn't going to complain about it. Beacon's courtyard was quiet as they walked back to their dorms. It had been almost an hour since their little tryst in Clingers, and Blake was still thinking about everything that had happened that day. Having calmed down since, she was a little worried she may have pushed things too far. She had noticed Ruby's hesitation at each step, and would have stopped had the girl even made any attempt to actually stop her, but she had definitely taken the lead and put them in those positions. She had even been the one to place the girl's hand on her hip and encouraged her to explore. So since they had a moment to themselves and were in what she considered to be one of Beacon's more beautiful courtyards, Blake came to a small stop near a tall fountain and guided the girl to sit down next to her.
Ruby? MMM?
The girl hummed, looking up from her scroll where she was sending a text message to Coco.
You okay? Yeah.
She nodded, though Ruby scowled a little as she noticed the lie.
Sorry, I just want to make sure that what happened was really okay now that we've, calmed down a little.
It was, Ruby said without hesitation, almost like she was prepared for the question.
I already told you I'd say if it was too much.
I know, she said with a smile.
I just want to make sure. That was a little different. Good different though.
Ruby smiled and gave her hand a squeeze.
I liked it. A lot. Okay,
she said with a nod. Before Blake could say anything else, Ruby pressed a light kiss into her lips that only lasted seconds. After she pulled back, Blake stared into the stunning silver and saw that they were trying their best to reassure her, so gave a kiss of her own in return. When they finally pulled back from each other though, Ruby spun around on the wall and laid back so that her head was on Blake's lap. They both knew they didn't have long until they were due for a sparring match with Team SPHR, but the peace and quiet of the courtyard was too much of a rarity to just leave behind. So with a small sigh of relief that everything that had happened had in fact been okay, she let her worries go and reached down to play with her girlfriend's hair.
And that's all for today. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.